Welcome to the next in our series of videos on membership matters. Let's continue from our last lesson. So if God's redemptive purpose was to save for himself a people who belong to him, who are these people? Deuteronomy 28:9-10 reads, "The Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he promised you on oath, if you keep the commands of the Lord your God and walk in obedience to him. Then all the peoples on earth will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they will fear you." Look at how Moses framed this description of God's people. The people of God here are presented as those who are called by my name. Now there's a sense in which this applies to every circumcised member of the nation of Israel. But Paul clarified that this was never the best way in which to understand God's people. Paul stated in Romans 3:28-29, "A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code." Neither national identity or physical symbolism was sufficient to create a people of God. Paul claims that it was always an inward mark that identified one as a member of God's people. This was as true in the Old Testament as it is in the New. Therefore, one of the central questions in deciding who should be identified as a member of a church is whether or not someone bears this inner mark of what Paul calls circumcision of the heart. Similarly, other people assume that God's people in the Old Testament identified themselves as God's people by living up to the law. However, this is not the teaching of either the Old or the New Testament. Genesis 15:6 states that Abram believed the Lord and it was credited to him as righteousness. In other words, Abraham was saved by faith. And at this point, it's reasonable to ask, well, faith in what? Jesus wouldn't come onto the scene for another couple thousand years after Abram. So God, in the first 11 chapters and 3 verses of Genesis, provides a promise of this Messiah. And it was Abraham's faith in this promise, even though he didn't know to whom it referred, and he didn't know how God would bring it about. It was Abram's faith in this promise that saved him. That's why this verse is quoted 5 times in the New Testament, to demonstrate that the mode of salvation was always through faith. There is no other means of salvation discussed in the scriptures other than by faith. Paul was clear in Romans 3 that the law was never given as a means of salvation. In fact, it was a means of condemnation. It drove one to throw themselves onto the mercy of God's grace. The writer of Hebrews explicitly claims that it has always been impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. Jesus claimed that no man comes to the Father except by me. And this claim in John 14:6 is absolute. There was never, could never be any other means of salvation other than faith in the promise, which was fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Therefore, the first aspect of belonging to the people of God, the community that we call the church, is the idea that we have faith in Jesus Christ, the fulfillment of the promise made back in Genesis. And this faith is evidenced by a heart turned towards God, or as Paul called it, a circumcision of the heart. In other words, someone who belongs to God's people not only has a profession of faith, but a life that illustrates that profession. Leviticus 11:44 reads, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves therefore, and be holy, for I am holy." God begins this verse with an allusion to his foundational redemptive purpose rooted in Genesis 3:15, that God will be our God. And because Yahweh is our God, this verse claims that we should be like him, that we should reflect him in our person. The defining characteristic of God is holiness, and as God's people, we should be holy as well. But this idea of holiness is so grand. Let's see if we can provide a helpful understanding of what holiness means. And in one sense, holiness is the absence of sin. Paul states in 1 Corinthians 7:1, "Therefore, Since we have these promises, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. This verse claims that the sin which contaminates our body and spirit separates us from the state of being holy. But being holy isn't merely the absence of something, but the presence of something. God continues on in Leviticus to claim, "You are to be holy to me, because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own." This echo of the passage back in 11:4 tells us that holiness isn't just the absence of something, but the presence of something. Holiness. Be holy. Furthermore, it is closely connected with this idea of consecration, or setting something apart towards something. So what is that something towards which we are set apart? What is suggested in Leviticus is made clear in Romans, where Paul states, "For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son." In other words, the defining characteristic of God's people, the defining understanding of holiness, is to look like God himself. God created us in his image, and then we are recreated into that same image. This is why the people which God creates for himself are frequently referred to as holy people. Deuteronomy 14:2 states, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession." The people whom God creates to be his own are holy to the Lord. That is, set apart to reflect his divine image. Peter echoed this rich Old Testament language in his famous declaration, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." Yet a few verses later, Peter connects the idea of holiness with Christ-likeness. "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example which you shall follow in his footsteps." Peter makes an even more profound statement in the opening of his second letter when he claims that the foundational promise of God allows us to, quote, "participate in the divine nature." Our holiness consists in how we reflect the character and being of God. So if God is gathering for himself a people who reflect his character and nature, then being a part of the church is a profound experience. It runs deeper than attending a church with good music or taking advantage of various programs. Being a part of a church is the context in which we learn to look more like Christ. This is the defining characteristic of the people of God. It's also something that requires a close, personal, and intimate relationship with other believers in your church. Closer than maybe you're comfortable with. Our participation in the people of God is the means by which we come to look more like God in his holiness. It's never described as a voluntary association where people find the best music, the most engaging programs, or ear-tickling sermons. Instead, participation in the people of God is always described as the mechanism by which God works his purposes in us. Not the place we work out our own purposes, not the place where we pursue our own personal preferences.